What happens when a man's greed completely blinds him? When he sees his loyal, quiet wife not as a partner, but as a stepping stone he's long since outgrown. Julian Aiden thought he had it all figured out. He would parade his dazzling new Mistress Chloe at the year's most exclusive gala, a public declaration that he was ready for a bigger, brighter life. He was sure his timid wife Erin would just shrink away as she always did. But he was oblivious to one earth-shattering fact. Erin's silence wasn't weakness, it was a weapon. Her modesty wasn't a character trait, it was a calculated illusion. And tonight, in a ballroom filled with the city's elite, that illusion is about to be shattered, and the silence that follows will be the sound of his entire world crumbling into dust. The scent of stale coffee and Julian's cloying expensive cologne hung in the air of their modestly decorated apartment. It was a combination that had come to represent Erin Aiden's life for the past 5 years, a blend of their simple reality and his desperate, clawing ambition. "Erin, are you even listening to me?" Julian's voice, sharp and impatient, cut through her thoughts. He was adjusting the knot of his silk tie in the hallway mirror, his reflection preening. "The Sterling Foundation Gala is tonight. It's the most important event of the year. Every major player in the city will be there. I need to make an impression." Erin looked up from the book she was reading, its pages filled with architectural designs she secretly studied. "I know, Julian. You've mentioned it every day for a month." Her voice was calm, a placid lake he constantly tried to turn into a storm. "And you still haven't bought a dress?" he scoffed, turning to face her. He gestured around their apartment, a space she had lovingly curated with tasteful second-hand furniture and subtle art. To him, it was a prison of mediocrity. "We can barely afford the ticket I managed to get from my boss, and you want to show up in that beige thing you wore to my cousin's wedding." The ticket hadn't come from his boss. She knew that. It had been anonymously delivered, a heavy cream-colored card with embossed silver lettering, a mystery he had quickly claimed as a fruit of his own networking genius. "I was planning on wearing the navy blue silk dress," she replied evenly, marking her page. "It's classic. It's boring, Erin." "It's what you are," he snapped, the cruelty in his words, a casual, everyday thing. "Tonight is about glamour, about power. It's about showing people like Marcus Thorne that I belong in their circle. I can't do that with a wallflower on my arm." Marcus Thorne. The name dripped from his lips with a toxic mix of envy and reverence. A young tech billionaire who had everything Julian craved. Erin's heart, a veteran of these small daily battles, gave a familiar dull ache. She had married Julian Aiden, believing in the man he'd pretended to be, a charming, ambitious go-getter who loved her for her mind and her quiet strength. She had willingly stepped into this life of contrived modesty, hiding the vast, glittering truth of her identity because she wanted to be loved for herself. She had given him 5 years to prove he was that man. 5 years of watching him curdle his ambition, souring into a bitter resentment aimed squarely at her for not being more, for not being his golden ticket. The irony was so thick she could taste it. "Perhaps you should go alone, then," she suggested softly, her eyes not leaving his. "You can network more freely." A flicker of something panic, then relief, crossed his face before he smoothed it over with a mask of magnanimity. No. A man needs his wife by his side. It looks good. Just try to look the part, okay? For me." He walked over and kissed her forehead, a cold, perfunctory gesture. I have to head to the office for a few hours. I'll see you there. 7 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." And with that, he was gone, leaving the scent of his ambition behind. Erin waited until she heard the sound of his car pulling away from the curb. Then she walked calmly into their bedroom. Her resolve, which had been hardening over the past few months, was now forged into steel. The final straw hadn't been his words just now, but a discovery she'd made 2 days prior. While tidying his office, a receipt had fallen from his briefcase. It was from Cartier. A single item, the Pluie de Diamants necklace. The price tag had 6 figures a sum that would take Julian, an acquisitions manager at a mid-level firm, a decade to earn. At the bottom, a small, handwritten note from the sales associate. "She will adore it, Mr. Aiden. It will look stunning on Miss Remington." Chloe Remington. The name echoed in her mind. A junior marketing associate at Julian's company. Erin had seen pictures of her from an office party online. Bright, flashy, with a predatory smile and eyes that screamed ambition. Chloe was everything Julian thought he wanted. A woman who looked like money. The necklace wasn't just an affair. It was a statement. It was Julian taking their shared meager funds and likely going into massive debt to adorn another woman, to purchase a life he felt Erin was denying him. He was taking Chloe to the Gala. He had no intention of her being there. His entire speech just now was a lie, a performance to ensure she stayed home nursing her hurt in their quiet apartment while he launched his new life. Erin stood before her own closet, pushing aside the simple, elegant clothes she wore for her life as Mrs. Aiden. Her hand found a hidden panel at the back. It slid open to reveal a single garment bag, opaque and black, and a velvet-lined jewelry case. They had been delivered discreetly a week ago. A slow smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were cold with purpose. "You want me to look the part, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. "You have no idea what part I was born to play." She pulled out her phone and made a call. An older, impeccably polite voice answered on the first ring. "Mr. Harrison, good afternoon. Miss Erin, is everything proceeding as you wish?" "Yes," she said, her voice dropping the softness of Erin Aiden and taking on an authority that had been dormant for 5 years. "Change of plans. I will be attending tonight. Please ensure my name is on the primary guest list. Not as a +1, as a guest of honor." There was a slight pause, and Mr. Aiden Erin's gaze drifted to a framed photo of her and Julian on their wedding day, his smile wide and triumphant. "Mr. Aiden," she said with chilling precision, "is about to have a very educational evening." To understand the magnitude of the game Erin was playing, one had to understand the name Sterling. The name wasn't just old money. It was foundational money. The Sterlings hadn't just bought into industries, they had built them. Sterling steel had forged the skeletons of skyscrapers that defined city skylines. Sterling tech had pioneered the microprocessors that powered the modern world. Their wealth wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was quiet, pervasive, and absolute, woven into the very fabric of the global economy. And at the head of it all was her grandfather, Alistair Sterling, a titan of industry, a philanthropist of legendary status, and the man who had orchestrated the entire Sterling Foundation. He was a force of nature with eyes that could assess a person's worth and their weaknesses in a single glance. Erin was his only grandchild, the sole heir to the Sterling Empire. From birth, she had been raised in a gilded sense of privilege and expectation. Tutors, not teachers. Boardrooms, not playgrounds. She learned about stock portfolios before she learned to drive. She could dissect a corporate merger with surgical precision by the age of 16. But the one thing she craved, the one thing all the sterling billions couldn't buy, was normalcy, authenticity. She watched potential suitors approach, their eyes gleaming not with affection for her, but with a lust for her name. They didn't see Erin. They saw a walking, talking trust fund, a beautiful key to an unbreakable vault. It was after a particularly nauseating encounter with a European duke whose family tree was as long as his list of debts that she made a pact with her grandfather. "I want to disappear," she had told him in his vast mahogany-panelled study, the scent of old leather and power filling the air. "Just for a while. I want to build a life on my own terms. I want to find someone who loves me. The woman who loves obscure architecture books and prefers rainy days. Not Erin Sterling the Heiress. Alistair, a man who could intimidate world leaders with a raised eyebrow, had looked at his granddaughter with a rare softness. He saw the steel of her grandmother in her spine. He agreed, but with conditions. She would take her mother's maiden name, Aidan. She would live on a generous but realistic trust that would allow for a comfortable middle-class life, nothing more. He would always be a phone call away with his right-hand man, the ever-loyal Mr. Harrison, as her discreet guardian and point of contact. "Go and find your truth, my girl." Alistair had said, his voice a low rumble. "But remember, a lioness who lives among sheep is still a lioness. Do not forget how to roar." And so Erin Sterling became Erin Aidan. She got a job as a research assistant at an architectural firm, a position she was more than qualified for, but which required none of her hidden expertise in corporate finance. It was there she met Julian. He was dazzling. He quoted poetry, remembered her favorite type of coffee, and seemed utterly captivated by her mind. He spoke of building a life together from the ground up, of shared dreams and mutual support. He never once asked about her family's money, seeming content with her vague story of a quiet, comfortable upbringing. For a time, Erin believed she had found it, the genuine article. The wedding was a small, tasteful affair, a world away from the society event it would have been. She had paid for it herself, from her trust, a fact Julian had conveniently glossed over as them pooling their resources. The first year was happy. The second, cracks began to show. Julian grew frustrated with his job. He'd come home complaining about his colleagues, his boss, the system that was holding him back. His compliments for Erin turned into critiques. Why wasn't she more ambitious? Why didn't she network with the partners at her firm? Why was she so content with their simple life? He didn't see her contentment as a choice, but as a lack of drive. He saw her quiet nature not as poise, but as passivity. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool, blaming the water for not being an ocean. And then came Chloe Remington, a woman who reflected his own shallow desires back at him. Now, as Erin stood in her bedroom, the phone call with Mr. Harrison complete, she felt a profound sadness mix with her cold anger. She had given Julian every chance to be the man he'd promised to be. She had given him the rarest gift she possessed, the real her, stripped of the sterling name. And he had looked right through her, deeming her worthless. Her grief, however, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tonight was not about mourning the death of her marriage. It was about her own resurrection. She opened the garment bag. Inside was a gown of deep midnight blue silk, so dark it was almost black. It was a custom creation by a designer known for dressing royalty. Its cut was deceptively simple, a high neck, long sleeves, a column silhouette that flowed to the floor. It was the epitome of understated elegance. It didn't scream for attention. It commanded it through sheer, unadulterated class. It was the kind of dress that made people look twice, not because of what it revealed, but because of the power of the woman wearing it. Next, she opened the jewelry case. Nestled on black velvet was not a cacophony of gems, but a single, breathtaking piece, the Star of Astor, a legendary sapphire passed down through the Sterling women for generations. It was a massive cornflower blue stone, surrounded by a halo of flawless diamonds hanging from a delicate platinum chain. It was a piece so famous it was instantly recognizable to anyone who mattered. It was a necklace that didn't just accessorize an outfit. It announced an arrival. She laid the dress and the necklace on her bed. For 5 years, she had played the role of Erin Aiden. Tonight, she would remind the world, and one man in particular, who Erin Sterling was. She wasn't just coming to the gala. She was coming to reclaim her throne. The crystal ballroom of the Grand Majestic Hotel was a symphony of excess. 3-tiered chandeliers dripping with thousands of crystals cast a warm golden glow over the city's elite. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the soft strains of a string quartet. This was Julian Aiden's paradise, the world he so desperately wanted to conquer. And he made his entrance as if he already owned it. On his arm was Chloe Remington, a vision in a skin-tight blood-red dress with a plunging neckline and a slit that ran dangerously high up her thigh. She was a fire engine in a room of stately Bentleys. Around her neck, sparkling with aggressive brilliance under the chandeliers, was the Cartier Pluie de Diamant necklace. It was a beautiful piece, but on her it looked less like an heirloom and more like plunder. They paused at the top of the grand staircase, a calculated move to ensure maximum visibility. Julian's chest was puffed out, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He surveyed the room, his eyes scanning for the powerful faces he recognized from business journals. Chloe clung to his arm, her smile dazzling and possessive. They were a portrait of gaudy ambition, a perfectly matched pair. "Julian, darling." "Everyone is staring," Chloe whispered, a thrill in her voice. "Let them stare," Julian murmured back, squeezing her hand. "This is where we belong." He guided her down the stairs, greeting people with a familiarity he didn't possess. He introduced Chloe not as his colleague, but with a vague proprietary air that left people to draw their own conclusions. The whispers started almost immediately. "Isn't that Julian Aiden? Where's his wife? That's not Erin. Who is that? My God, the nerve. At the Sterling Foundation Gala of all places." The name of the gala's host was a delicious irony that was lost on Julian. To him, Sterling was just a brand, a name on a building synonymous with the power he craved. He had no idea it was the name on his wife's birth certificate. As he was laughing a little too loudly at a joke made by a banking executive, the main doors to the ballroom opened again. A hush began at the entrance and spread through the room like a ripple in a pond. The string quartet seemed to falter for a moment. Conversations trailed off. Heads turned. Erin stood there. She was not the Erin they knew, the quiet, mousy wife who faded into the wallpaper at corporate events. The woman at the door was an entirely different creature. Her midnight blue gown didn't glitter. It absorbed the light, creating an aura of deep, magnetic elegance. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated chignon, showcasing the graceful line of her neck. And on her neck, resting against her collarbone, was the Star of Astor. The sapphire drank the light of the chandeliers and glowed with an internal fire, a beacon of impossible blue. To the uninitiated, it was a stunning piece of jewelry. To the city's old guard, the connoisseurs of wealth and power, it was a solemn statement of intent. It was like seeing a king walk into a room wearing his crown. She descended the grand staircase, her movements fluid and unhurried. She didn't look at the crowd, but her presence filled the room. The whispers changed. Puzzled curiosity turned into stunned admiration. Julian saw her. His smile froze, then melted from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His champagne flute tilted in his hand, a little of the golden liquid sloshing over the side. "What the hell is she doing here?" he hissed under his breath. Chloe followed his gaze, her perfectly painted smile tightening. Her eyes narrowed with cat-like suspicion, raked over Erin. She saw the dress, the poise, and then she saw the necklace. Chloe knew diamonds. She knew their value, their cut, their fire. But the stone on Erin's neck was something else entirely. It made her own brand-new Cartier piece feel like a cheap trinket from a department store. An ugly seed of doubt began to sprout in the fertile ground of her ambition. Erin reached the bottom of the stairs, her expression serene. She moved through the crowd, which parted for her, as if by instinct. Several influential matriarchs of the city's oldest families, women who had never given Erin Aiden a second glance, nodded at her, with newfound respect, their eyes fixed on the sapphire. They recognized it. They understood. Julian, recovering his composure, strode towards her, his face a thundercloud of fury. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the delicate silk. "What is this, Erin?" He seethed, his voice a low growl, meant only for her. "What are you doing here? And where did you get that thing?" Erin looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. Her expression was utterly unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply waited. "Let go of my arm, Julian," she said. Her voice quiet, but laced with a command he had never heard before. "Not until you tell me what's going on. You were supposed to be at home. We talked about this." His voice was rising, attracting more attention. Chloe had followed him, a silent, menacing shadow. "Julian, who is this?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well. It was a power play, an attempt to assert her dominance. Julian ignored her. His focus was entirely on Erin, his mind racing. Where did she get the dress? The necklace? Did she have a secret benefactor? A lover? The thought was so absurd, so contrary to the woman he thought he knew, that it almost made him laugh. The most plausible explanation was that they were fakes, high-quality replicas meant to embarrass him. "Is that thing even real?" he sneered, jabbing a finger towards the Star of Astor. "Did you rent this ridiculous costume to try and make me jealous?" "It's pathetic." Erin slowly extricated her arm from his grasp. She looked at him, then at Chloe, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the diamond necklace. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. "Everything I am wearing is real, Julian," she said, her voice as clear and cool as the crystal flutes around them. "I think the better question is anything about you real?" Before he could retort, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a distinguished silver-haired man walked onto the stage. The murmuring of the crowd immediately ceased. It was Alistair Sterling. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept across the room. They paused for a moment, finding Erin. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. Julian didn't see it. He was too consumed by his own rage. "This isn't over," he whispered menacingly to Erin. "We will have a long talk when we get home." "No, Julian." Erin replied, her voice soft but final, as she turned her attention to the stage. "I don't think we will." The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and the hunter was about to make his move. Alistair Sterling stood at the podium, a figure of immense and unassuming power. He commanded the room not with volume, but with presence. The crystal ballroom, moments before a cacophony of whispers and speculation, was now so quiet you could hear the fizz of champagne bubbles. "Good evening." Alistair's voice resonated rich and calm through the sound system. "And welcome. For 50 years, the Sterling Foundation has been dedicated to a simple principle that those with the means have a responsibility to build a better future. We have funded hospitals, endowed universities, and championed the arts. But a foundation, like any great structure, cannot rest on its past achievements. It must look forward. It must evolve." Julian stood rigid beside Erin, a coiled spring of fury. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her defiance, her clothes, her presence here, it was a coordinated attack on his big night. He saw his ambitions so close just moments ago, slipping through his fingers. He leaned in close to Erin's ear, his breath hot and angry. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life," he whispered venomously. "You will regret this." Erin didn't even turn her head. Her focus remained on her grandfather, her posture a study in serene composure. She was no longer a participant in Julian's small domestic drama. She was an audience to a much grander play. Chloe, meanwhile, was experiencing a dawning, sickening sense of dread. She was no fool. She had clawed her way up from nothing by being an astute observer of power dynamics. And right now, every social instinct she possessed was screaming that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The way the room had deferred to Erin, the way Alistair Sterling's gaze had briefly but pointedly settled on her, it was all wrong. Erin wasn't supposed to matter. She was the dowdy, forgotten wife. But the woman standing here exuded an aura of quiet authority that Chloe, for all her manufactured glamour, could never hope to replicate. On stage, Alistair continued. "Evolution requires new leadership, new vision. For 2 decades, I have had the privilege of chairing this foundation. But the time has come to pass the torch. The future of the Sterling Foundation, and indeed the future of the Sterling legacy itself, must be placed in the hands of the next generation." A buzz of anticipation went through the crowd. This was unexpected. The succession of the Sterling Empire was a topic of intense speculation in financial circles. Alistair was a widower with 1 deceased child and a single, never-seen, almost mythical granddaughter. Most assumed he would appoint a trusted non-family CEO to lead the foundation. Julian's mind, ever the opportunist, started whirring. A new leader. A new power center. Perhaps this evening could be salvaged after all, if he could just get a brief introduction, make an impression. Alistair paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The person who will be taking my place as chairperson of the Sterling Foundation is someone who embodies the values we hold dear: integrity, intelligence, humility, and a strength that is often most powerful when it is quiet." He smiled, a genuine, proud smile that transformed his stern features. She has spent the last several years living a life of deliberate simplicity, proving to herself and to me that character is not forged in privilege, but in purpose. She wanted to be valued for who she is, not what she is set to inherit, and she has succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Julian's attention was now fully on the stage, his spat with Erin momentarily forgotten. He, like everyone else, was hanging on Alistair's every word, wondering which scion of which powerful family was about to be anointed. Erin closed her eyes for a brief second. This was it. The end of one life, the beginning of another. She felt a pang of sadness for the simple, anonymous days, but it was overshadowed by a surge of liberating power. She had honored her quest. She had sought love and found a lesson. Now it was time to come home. So it is with immense pride and absolute confidence, Alistair's voice boomed, reaching every corner of the silent ballroom, that I introduce to you the new heart of the Sterling legacy, my granddaughter, and the new chairperson of the Sterling Foundation. Alistair looked directly out into the crowd, his gaze locking with Erin's. He didn't need to search for her. He had known where she was all along. Julian, standing beside her, felt a cold knot of confusion tighten in his stomach. He saw where the great Alistair Sterling was looking. It made no sense. He was looking right at them. Right at Erin. A horrifying, impossible thought, a tiny splinter of cosmic dread, began to wedge its way into his consciousness. Sterling. The Sterling Foundation. Erin Sterling. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A ridiculous, insane coincidence. And then Alistair Sterling said the name. My granddaughter, Erin Sterling Aiden. The name dropped into the cavernous silence of the crystal ballroom like a stone into a frozen lake. For a single stretched-out second, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the collective, stillant processing of 1,000 minds trying to connect two impossibly disparate dots, the mousy, unassuming wife of a mid-level manager and the sole legendary heiress to the Sterling fortune. Then the shatter. A woman in the front row gasped a sound that was unnaturally loud in the stillness. A photographer, acting on pure instinct, raised his camera, and the blinding flash of his strobe light was like a lightning strike, illuminating the scene in stark, unforgiving detail. Julian Aiden's face was a mask of utter devastation. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes wide, with a horror so profound it was almost comical. The gears in his brain were grinding, trying to compute a reality his entire world view was built to reject. Erin. His Erin. The woman he had berated for buying store-brand coffee, the woman he had called boring and passionless, was the Sterling Heiress. It was a cosmic joke of such cruel magnificence that his mind simply refused to accept it. Chloe Remington's reaction was a different but no less dramatic spectacle. Her glamorous facade cracked and fell away, revealing the raw, panicked ambition beneath. Her eyes darted from Erin to Alistair Sterling on the stage, and then down to the Cartier necklace around her own neck. It suddenly felt like a lead weight, a vulgar shackle, branding her as a fool. She had hitched her wagon to a shooting star, only to discover it was a lit match, and the woman she had dismissed as a speck of dust owned the entire night sky. Every single person in the room turned to look at the trio. The whispers that had followed them before were now replaced by a stunned, gaping silence. They weren't looking at Julian Aiden, the ambitious husband, or Chloe Remington, the Scarlet Woman. They were looking at Erin, but they weren't seeing her anymore. They were seeing a legacy, They were seeing sterling steel. Sterling tech, billions of dollars and generations of unshakable power, all embodied in the calm, poised woman in the midnight blue dress. The star of Astor on her chest no longer looked like a beautiful accessory. It looked like what it was a symbol of office. A crown. On stage, Alistair smiled. "Erin, would you join me?" As if waking from a trance. Erin took a step forward. The crowd, as one, seemed to shrink back, parting for her, creating a wide, clear path to the stage. It was a spontaneous coronation. Julian reached out his hand, trembling, and grabbed her arm again. But this time his grip was not angry. It was desperate, pleading. "Erin, what is he talking about?" He stammered, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable croak. "Honey, this is a joke, right? A prank." Erin stopped and turned to face him fully. For the first time all night, she let him see into her eyes. There was no anger there, no triumph, just a vast, cold emptiness, and a finality that chilled him to the bone. "The only joke here, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear, audible to the dozen or so people closest to them, "was our marriage." She pulled her arm from his grasp with a quiet finality, and continued her walk to the stage, her every step graceful and sure. She ascended the small set of stairs, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor. She reached the podium and stood beside her grandfather, turning to face the room. She was home. Alistair placed a proud hand on her shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filled with pride, "the future." And then the silence broke. The room exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. The sound of 1,000 people simultaneously recognizing a seismic shift in the landscape of power. Cameras flashed incessantly, turning the scene into a flickering, strobe-lit tableau. Journalists were already on their phones, their voices urgent, breaking the biggest society story of the decade. Julian stood frozen, a statue of ruin in the middle of the floor. People were now actively avoiding him, their eyes sliding past him as if he were invisible. He was no longer a player. He was a footnote in the story of Erin Sterling's return, a spectacular, self-immolating fool. He looked at Chloe. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup and shattered dreams. She met his gaze for a second, her expression filled with a mixture of pity and pure contempt. Without a word, she turned and all but fled, pushing her way through the gawking crowd, her red dress a flag of humiliating defeat. She was toxic now, and she knew it. Julian was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a room full of people. The brilliant lights of the chandeliers suddenly feeling like harsh, interrogating spotlights exposing him for exactly what he was. The man who had a winning lottery ticket in his hand for 5 years and had used it to wipe his shoes. The moments after the announcement were a blur of chaotic energy. The city's most powerful figures, men and women, who Julian had dreamed of merely shaking hands with, swarmed the stage. But they weren't there for Alistair Sterling. They were all surging towards Erin. They circled her not with the pitying glances she had grown accustomed to, but with a palpable reverence. They complimented her poise, her grace, her brilliant strategy. They saw her 5 years of quiet life, not as a period of obscurity, but as a masterful play, a test of character she had passed with flying colors. "Alistair, she has your grandmother's eyes." And her cunning commented a formidable banking CEO, a woman known as the Iron Dame of Wall Street. An absolutely brilliant succession plan, and tech mogul declared, shaking Alistair's hand while his eyes remained fixed on Erin. A true Sterling move. Erin handled it all with an innate composure that felt both new and ancient. She shook hands, accepted compliments, and spoke about her vision for the Foundation's future with an eloquence and insight that left them spellbound. The architectural researcher was gone. The quiet wife had vanished. In her place stood a leader born and bred for this role, who had simply been waiting for the right moment to claim it. Across the ballroom, Julian was a man adrift in a hostile sea. The same people who had been clapping him on the back an hour earlier now looked through him. He tried to catch the eye of his boss, who was standing near the bar, but the man pointedly turned his back. Julian had become a social leper, a cautionary tale being whispered from one designer clutch to another. Finally, a desperate last-ditch survival instinct kicked in. He had to fix this. He had to get to Erin, to explain, to beg. He pushed his way through the crowd, a frantic, pathetic figure moving against the tide of admiration flowing towards the stage. He reached the steps just as Erin was descending, her grandfather by her side. "Erin," he called out, his voice cracking. "Honey, we need to talk." She stopped, her expression impassive. The crowd around them fell silent again, eager for the next scene in this gripping real-life drama. "You should have told me," he pleaded, his voice now slick with a desperate, cloying sincerity. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? We could have—" "I would have." "You would have what?" "Julian." Erin asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Loved me." "You had 5 years to love the woman, but you were only ever interested in the resume. You didn't want a wife, you wanted an asset. You just weren't a savvy enough investor to realize what you had." His face flushed with shame and anger. "That's not true. I love you. This is all just a misunderstanding." A single dry laugh escaped Erin's lips. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. A misunderstanding. Was it a misunderstanding when you belittled my interests and mocked my contentment? Was it a misunderstanding when you complained every day about our life? A life I chose to see if you were genuine and tell me was the Cartier necklace you bought for Miss Remington. Also a misunderstanding. The mention of the necklace and Chloe's name was the final public nail in his coffin. A fresh wave of scandalized murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Julian flinched as if struck. He had nothing. No defense. No lie slick enough to slide his way out of this. Erin took a step closer, her eyes holding his. She leaned in slightly and delivered the final devastating blow. "You always said you wanted a partner who could open doors for you, Julian," she said, her voice a perfectly pitched whisper that was somehow as clear as a bell. "The problem is, you never realized I owned the building." She turned away from him, then a dismissal so complete it was like an execution. Mr. Harrison, her grandfather's ever-present aide, materialized by her side, along with a team of professional security, who flanked her and Alistair, creating an impenetrable human wall. Julian reached out one last time. "Erin, please." But she didn't look back. He was part of a past she was already leaving behind. As she walked toward the grand exit, the crowd parted for her once more, her midnight blue dress a slash of definitive color against the glittering backdrop. She wasn't just leaving the gala. She was exiting the entire chapter of her life that he had defined. Julian Aiden was left alone on the steps, the sympathetic and scornful looks of the entire city elite boring into him. His grand entrance had turned into a spectacular implosion. He had flown to the sun on wings of arrogance and deceit, and in the brilliant, unforgiving light of the truth, they had melted, sending him crashing back to an earth that was now a scorched and barren landscape of his own making. The silence that fell around him was no longer one of respect or awe. It was the silence of a tomb. 6 months had passed since the night the Crystal Ballroom had become Julian's Colosseum. From her office on the 80th floor of the Sterling Tower, Erin Aidan, or as the world now exclusively knew her, Erin Sterling watched the afternoon sun cast long dramatic shadows between the skyscrapers of the city. The view was a god's eye perspective, a panorama of power and potential that still on quiet days took her breath away. Her office was a world away from the cramped, book-filled apartment she had once called home. That space had been defined by the scent of old paper and Julian's simmering resentment. This one smelled of fresh orchids, polished marble, and the clean electric hum of global commerce. The walls were a soft gallery, white adorned not with gilt-framed portraits of ancestors, but with bold modern art, and her own framed architectural sketches, the very ones she used to hide away in notebooks. Her desk wasn't the imposing mahogany behemoth of her grandfather, but a sleek, minimalist expanse of white Italian marble, cool and unyielding to the touch. It was a space that spoke not of inherited legacy, but of a future being actively designed. The transition had been a baptism by fire. The media frenzy following the gala had been relentless. Paparazzi had camped outside her grandfather's estate for weeks. Tabloids had spun lurid tales, painting her as a cunning manipulator, a black widow in waiting. But for every salacious headline, there were 10 more hailing her as a feminist icon, a brilliant strategist who had played the long game and won. The Sterling public relations machine, a formidable force, had worked quietly in the background, shaping the narrative, highlighting her intelligence and her 5-year quest for authenticity. They didn't have to invent anything. They simply had to tell the truth. The truth, it turned out, was the most compelling story of all. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Robert Harrison, no longer just the discreet guardian, but her chief of staff and trusted confidant, entered with a slim tablet. His posture was still impeccably formal, but the deference in his eyes had been replaced by a deep collaborative respect. "Ma'am," he began. "Robert," she corrected him gently, a familiar refrain in their new dynamic. "What's the latest on the Northwood project? The Clean Energy Initiative is performing beyond expectations." He reported a rare hint of excitement in his voice. "The solar farm installation is ahead of schedule, and our initial output projections were too conservative by nearly 15%. The board is ecstatic. You were right to push for the upgraded photovoltaic technology." "Good." She nodded, a sense of deep satisfaction warming her. The project had been her first major undertaking as chairperson. Her grandfather's generation had built their empire on steel and microchips, the bedrock of the 20th century. Her legacy, she had decided, would be built on something sustainable, something that looked forward, not back. It was a quiet rebellion against the old ways, and it was working. And the Community Arts Center. The architectural firm has submitted the final schematics. They are exceptional, Robert said, placing the tablet on her desk. The lead architect, David Chen, said he's never had a client with such a clear and insightful vision. It's as if you could see the building before the first line was ever drawn. Erin smiled. David Chen. She remembered him from her old firm, a kind, talented senior architect who had always taken the time to praise her research, never treating her like the invisible assistant she was supposed to be. When the Sterling Foundation had announced the commission for the new centre, his small, brilliant firm had submitted a proposal. Awarding them the contract over several international giants had been her first official act, a statement that she valued talent and decency over pedigree. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way. She swiped through the digital renderings on the tablet, a beautiful light-filled structure of glass, reclaimed wood, and living green walls designed to be a vibrant, accessible hub for the city's artists. It was the antithesis of the stuffy, exclusive galleries Julian had so admired. This was a building for everyone. It was her soul rendered in steel and light. As she was studying the plans, Robert cleared his throat. "There is one other item, the final security update you requested." He placed a simple, sealed manila envelope on her desk. His expression was neutral, but she knew this was the part of the job he disliked. The loose ends. She took it, her fingers steady. "Thank you, Robert. That will be all for now." After he left, she sat for a long moment, staring at the envelope. It contained the final report on Julian Aiden and Chloe Remington. Her legal team had advised her to sever all ties, to never look back, but she had needed to know. Not out of lingering affection or a desire for vengeance, but for a sense of absolute closure. She needed to see the final page of the chapter before she could truly close the book. She broke the seal. The report was concise, clinical. Julian, unable to find work in any major financial sector due to the notoriety of his spectacular misjudgment, as one financial journal had delicately put it, had been forced to sell his luxury car and move to a small town in the Midwest. He was working as a regional sales manager for a company that sold industrial cleaning supplies. The report included a single, grainy surveillance photo of him walking out of a budget motel. His shoulders slumped, the arrogant swagger she knew so well completely gone. He looked diminished grey, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own ambition. He had grasped for a kingdom and was left with a life of desolate mediocrity. The divorce itself had been a brutal, clarifying affair. She remembered sitting in a sterile conference room across from him and his beleaguered public defender-level lawyer. Julian had attempted a final, desperate performance, his voice choked with false tears, speaking of his unwavering love and the profound shock of her deception. He'd argued that his infidelity with Chloe was a cry for help, a symptom of the emotional distance she had created. Her lead counsel, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Catherine Shaw, who had been the Sterling family lawyer for 30 years, had simply let him finish. Then, without a word, she had played a recording. It was from the Gala, captured by a journalist's microphone. Julian's venomous whisper to Erin, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life," echoed in the silent room. Catherine had followed it by sliding a stack of glossy photos across the table. Julian and Chloe, on lavish dates paid for with credit cards he was drowning in debt to maintain. And the final piece, a copy of the Cartier receipt, a monument to his folly. Julian's performance had crumbled. The judge had finalized the divorce in under an hour, enforcing the prenup he had once scoffed at with ruthless efficiency. He had left with nothing. Chloe Remington's fate was detailed on the second page of the report. After being fired, she had attempted to sell a tell-all story to the tabloids. But the Sterling name carried more weight than a disgraced mistress's fleeting fame. A few quiet phone calls from the Sterling legal department to the publishers, reminding them of the intricate web of advertising and partnerships they shared, had been enough. The story was killed. No one would touch her. The last known report had her working as a hostess in a resort town in another country. The Cartier necklace long since sold for a fraction of its worth. She had gambled everything on one man, and had lost spectacularly. Erin closed the folder and placed it in the secure shredder next to her desk. As the machine whirred, destroying the last physical record of her past life, she felt not a flicker of the triumph. There was no joy in their ruin, only a profound and weary sense of justice. It was the inevitable mathematical result of their choices. They hadn't been destroyed by her power. They had been destroyed by their own character flaws, which her power had simply illuminated for the world to see. Later that week, she had lunch with her grandfather. It had become a weekly ritual. They met not in a stuffy club, but at a small, unassuming Italian restaurant downtown, where the owner knew Alistair simply as Mr. S. "You look well, my girl," Alistair said, his keen eyes assessing her over his glass of wine. "This life suits you." "It's busy," she admitted, a small smile playing on her lips. "But it's a good kind of busy. It feels constructive." "I never doubted it would," he said. He paused, swirling his wine. "I do owe you an apology, however. I should have warned you more forcefully about Julian. I saw the weakness in him from the start, that insatiable hunger for things he hadn't earned." Erin shook her head. "No. This was my journey, grandfather. My test. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know that I could build a life, that I could be loved without the Sterling name as a shield or a lure. I got my answer." "And what was the answer?" he asked gently. "That the name was never a shield. It's a responsibility," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won certainty. "And that true love can't be found when you're hiding part of yourself, no matter the reason." The real lesson wasn't about him. It was about me. I spent so much time trying to prove my worth to others that I forgot to simply inhabit my own. Alistair reached across the table and patted her hand, a rare gesture of open affection. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have her strength, but you have your own wisdom." As the sun began to set, casting the city in hues of orange and violet, Erin stood once more at the vast window of her office. She thought of Julian and Chloe, not with anger, but with a distant clinical pity. They were small people, consumed by small desires. They would forever be a footnote in her story, while she was just beginning to write her own epic. The loneliness of her position was real. The weight of the responsibility was immense. But for the first time in her life, she felt completely, authentically herself. She was not Erin Aidan, the quiet wife. She was not just Erin Sterling, the heiress. She was Erin, a builder, a leader, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not scorched but forged. She had sought a partnership, and instead found her purpose. And as she looked out at the endless city lights beginning to sparkle below, she knew with an unshakable certainty that it was a far greater prize. Erin's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the most powerful. It's a story about the devastating price of greed and underestimation. But more than that, it's about the incredible strength that comes from knowing your own worth. Julian saw a stepping stone. He was too blind to see the mountain. Erin didn't need a dramatic rescue. She orchestrated her own magnificent victory, proving that the best revenge isn't loud and explosive, but a life lived brilliantly and on her own terms. What did you think of Julian's ultimate downfall? Was it the justice he deserved? And what would you have done in Erin's shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of betrayal and empowerment, please smash that like button. share it with someone who loves a good drama, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have so many more compelling stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.